Well, hey there, everybody, and welcome back once again. Today, we're going to be starting a new chapter, chapter 3, which is called The Colonies Come of Age. And if you think about that phrase, coming of age, it means like growing up. It means coming into your own, that transition between childhood and adulthood. And so we're going to use that analogy here to talk about these colonies. So in the previous chapter, we talked about these American colonies, the 13 colonies, about their origins, about why they were started, who settled them. And we were talking about those colonies really in the context of their formative years when they were just getting started. In chapter 3, we're fast forwarding now to where these colonies are no longer just little settlements and outposts here or there, a handful of people just trying to survive in the wilderness and the woods. We're talking now, decades later, in some cases, maybe even a century later, depending on which colony you're talking about, in which now it's not just a couple of hundred people, but thousands, actually, eventually, even about 2 million settlers in these colonies of England, to where they're not just little settlements here and a fort there and a backwoods little settlement where people are just kind of scraping by there. There still are those. But we're also talking about by now, big cities like New York and Philadelphia and Charleston and Savannah and Richmond and all those kinds of places that are really thriving, flourishing cities, and Boston and Hartford and all these different things. And by this time, even depending on who you're talking about, but families and communities that have been settled and have been in these colonies for generations, people that are now at least one generation removed from England, people that have never lived on the mainland and don't have a whole lot of a whole lot of communication with, or whole contact is the word I'm looking for there. So we're looking here at how these colonies sort of come into their own. How did they develop beyond those original colonial origins? How did they change? How did they stay the same? And also, how do they eventually develop? And really, eventually is not the right word because it happened from the beginning. But in what ways did they start to develop their own personality? Did they start to develop their own character? In what ways are they very, very much like their English counterparts? Are they very much British people and part of the British or English Empire? And in what ways are they unique? Where and what causes them to develop a distinctive culture, a distinctive sense of identity, and something that does separate them from their English counterparts? In this first section, we're going to talk more about the economic relationship between these colonies and England, or at this point, I might start saying Britain a whole lot more, or I might even refer to them, sometimes we might refer to them as the mother country or the home country. You have to think of this whole arrangement as your home country, your mother country, in this case Britain or England, and then the colonies are kind of like the children, as it were, and they are underneath that umbrella. They are citizens. The people are citizens of the British Empire, but as we will see, that didn't mean that they always at least felt they were being treated the same way. So today we're going to talk about that economic relationship and how that led to both good and bad things, and how that helped the colonies to develop in some ways, but also how it contributes to their overall character and personality. Now we're getting into a time where England is becoming, certainly one of the most powerful countries on earth and becoming an economic powerhouse as well. And that is going to lead to some good things for the colonies. One of the reasons the American colonies are going to grow so quickly and become so financially successful, and how merchants are going to become prosperous and trade is going to become prosperous, England has a lot to do with that. And their economic relationship with the colonies is very important to them, and it's very important to the colonies as well. And all of this comes back to an economic theory that the English and a lot of European nations were practicing at this time, something called mercantilism. And if you look at that word mercantilism, you might notice that it kind of looks and sounds a little bit like merchant, which is like a shopkeeper or a business owner. And mercantilism has to do with money and trade and business. So that should clue you into the fact that this is something along those lines. So mercantilism is an economic theory, and it was the economic wisdom of the day between sometime in the 1600s until sometime in the 1800s. It started to be started to go out of style and started to be seen as sort of the old way of doing things and not the best way. But this was the economic theory that most European nations believed in, This was, in their mind, this was the smartest way to run your economy and to run your country, was based off of these ideas of mercantilism. Mercantilism is what made you successful. Mercantilism is what made you powerful, because ultimately what all of these countries that are practicing mercantilism, and again, Britain was not the only one. France is practicing mercantilism. Most of your European countries were. But ultimately, for them, in order to be powerful, you needed to be wealthy. That it wasn't just about military power and having all of that, but it was about economic power. You needed to have money. And mercantilism is rather complex. We're going to try to explain it here as simply as we can. Mercantilism is based on a few major principles. One of them being, in order to practice mercantilism, in order to be successful, you want to maximize your exports. That means export more stuff, export more goods than you are importing. In other words, we call that an economics balance of trade, balancing what you're actually sending out versus what you're bringing in. In mercantilism, you want balance of trade to be in your favor. You want to discourage the kind of things you're having to import in from other countries. You don't want to be buying a bunch of stuff from other countries. You want to be exporting out to them. And that can, if you think about it logically, that makes some sense. We want to sell more than we buy. And in order to do that, in order to make this work, in order to make that balance of trade work in your favor, there were several things that you needed to do. One of them, what it eventually boils down to, was colonies. And for mercantilist countries, you needed colonies. And this is why so many countries like Britain and France and several others, why they eventually start to desire overseas colonies like the American colonies. They fit into and they are a part of the puzzle here for mercantilism, because colonies provided cheap natural resources. That was part of the reason that you really needed colonies. You needed their resources. You needed to exploit. That's an important word when it comes to mercantilism. Exploiting means like taking advantage of. You needed to exploit those resources and use them to your advantage. Colonies, as well as providing, abundant natural resources for you to use, colonies also provided markets for trade, the selling part. So let's just use this as a practical example. We're Britain. We want to practice mercantilism. We want this balance of trade to be in our favor. We want to export more than we import, and therefore we want colonies, because those colonies are a place of resources for us. For example, timber. For example, we'll talk later about different, economic activities, but tobacco or whatever else it was they were getting from those colonies. Timber, for example, wood from the abundant forests in the Americas, and then we're going to use that to manufacture into various other goods, which we can then sell. And because these are our colonies, we can manipulate the situation to where we'll pay really, really low prices for that timber, and then we can turn right back around and sell all those things that we are making not only to other nations, but we can sell to those colonies. So colonies were important, not just as as a means of cheap natural resources, and they were to be exploited for that, but also as a means of selling the goods that you want to sell. Another feature of mercantilism is control. Mercantilism is all about control and manipulation. In a mercantilist country, you want to put lots of regulations, lots of rules about who can trade with who and what they can trade, and there's lots of taxes and there's lots of duties and there's lots of just intervention here by the government to manipulate that situation so that they are profiting off of trade, that they are profiting off of their colonies, that nobody else is profiting off their colonies. Mercantilism means that countries like Britain, governments like Britain, are going to view their colonies as a means of making money. They exist to benefit the mother country. They exist so that they can squeeze every last drop of money they can out of them and really exploit that situation in their favor. So this really defines the economic relationship with these colonies. Now, that sounds immediately like that's terrible for the colonists, that people living in those colonies are just being robbed of their resources and, restrictions everywhere, and that is part of it. But there were a lot of benefits to this for the colonies. There were a lot of things about this mercantilist system that worked in the colonies' favor, and how it does actually help them in a few ways. For one thing, this does it does lead to successful and significant economic development in these colonies. This is one of the reasons why and how colonial trade becomes such big business. And that potentially makes a lot of colonists extremely wealthy. They have a valuable trading partner in Britain. They know that Britain wants to trade with them, that Britain is going to buy the stuff that they are producing. And that's a good thing. Business is business. And that means they're going to have good, strong businesses. There's lots of opportunity there for a lot of colonists to make some money, because they know if they're going to, have a farm or a sawmill or something like that, Britain is going to want to buy those resources. So it's why we see economic growth and development really take off in these colonies. It's because of mercantilism. England doesn't just look at these colonies and say, well, you're on your own. They're going to contribute to that economic development. And that means, money to be made. And that's a good thing for a lot of people. It also means the colonies are very well supplied with things that they need and that they want. It means a comfortable living for them once they get pretty well established. Because like I said, part of mercantilism, part of the reason for colonies is that is then a market for you to turn around and sell manufactured goods. So Britain wants to sell to the colonies all kind of manufactured goods that they are making. For the colonists, they might look at that as pretty good. They are not going to lack for nice consumer goods to make their daily lives easier and to enjoy. They're going to have plenty of clothing. They're going to have shoes. They're going to go into the shop and see nice, pretty dishes and furnishings and different things for them to buy. Britain's going to keep them well supplied with that stuff to purchase, of course, because that's part of mercantilism, is that sell, sell, sell. Another important benefit for the colonies is it does provide them with a significant amount of protection. This means that they are a valuable asset to Britain, and Britain is going to protect them. And Britain, I don't mean to say that there's, like soldiers everywhere just, protect our colonists kind of a thing, but they were important. It means that Britain will defend them and Britain will protect them, and they will have the protection of the British military when necessary, that their trade is going to have the protection of the British Navy, which, by the way, was one of the most powerful on earth at this time. And so to be under that umbrella, to be part of the most successful and most powerful empire on earth was probably not considered to be a bad thing by most American colonists. So they do enjoy both those economic benefits and you could even say military benefits. Gotta turn the lights back on always, from being a part of that empire. But it obviously does come with a lot of downsides, and some of these have really already been pointed out. A downside for the colonies is those restrictions. Mercantilism is all about control and restrictions. This means that they do not have what we would call free trade. We would say free trade in that you can trade with who you want to, and the government does not, make rules about who can trade with who and for what price and all that kind of stuff. In our economy today, the government's there's some restrictions, of course, but pretty hands off compared to this whole situation. And that means that the colonists, they don't have free trade. They are not free to make their own decisions about their economies. They are not free to make their own decisions about who they want to trade with and for how much. They basically are forced to trade with Britain most of the time. So they are not able to get the best price, perhaps. Britain's going to give them, we know Britain's going to buy these goods and they're going to pay X amount of money, but the colonists might be left to wonder, well, what if I was able to trade with this country? What if this country would give me more for it? But they're not free to enter into those kind of negotiations. They're not free to enter into those kinds of arrangements and deals. They can't do that on their own. Britain does all that for them, and Britain is trying to make sure that they're the ones that make the money. So that does put a lot of strict limitations, and therefore it limits their business. They would be wondering, how much better could we be doing if we were able to make those kinds of decisions ourselves? How much more could we be making if we were able to make those decisions themselves? It does put a lot of restrictions. It does hold them back. It stifles. To stifle means to hold something back or hold it under. It stifles a lot of colonial businesses, and they're not allowed. There's a lot of restrictions on manufacturing manufacturing in the colonies. Now, this is before the Industrial Revolution to begin with, but there are rules and there are outright restrictions. There are plenty of things the colonists aren't supposed to be producing for themselves. Britain doesn't want them to produce all these manufactured goods themselves, because then they won't need to buy it from Britain anymore. So there's all these other restrictions. And again, a lot of colonists might be left to wonder, how much better could we do if Britain wasn't always telling us what to do? How much more could our economy grow if we were free to really let it grow the way that we want it to? And the other big disadvantage for mercantilism is more of a feeling, and that's a feeling of exploitation. Again, exploitation means to feel used, and this does make the colonists feel used. It makes them feel taken advantage of, and they were being used and taken advantage of. And I don't think the British government would deny that. They would say, yeah, that's part of it. That's why you exist. You are here for that. But they would say, what's good for the mother country, what's good for the empire is good for you. This is all about making the empire wealthier and powerful and more stronger, and ultimately that does benefit the colonists. But it does make them feel like they are being robbed of something, that they are being sort of taken for all they can get, or Britain is taking everything that they have and not paying them well for it, that they're just being sucked dry of everything that's valuable and not being given full pay and not being treated fairly, and kind of seen as second class, and you're just here to make money and all that sort of thing. So there's definitely a feeling of not being valued and not being well supported, and not really being cared about all that much, with the exception of just making money. Now let's talk about how Britain actually goes about enforcing that policy of mercantilism. How do they actually go about putting it into practice? So that's all the theory. You got to trade, you got to have colonies. You want the balance of trade to be in your favor. You're going to control trade. You're going to put restrictions on things. You're going to put taxes on things. You're going to make sure that you're intercepting the money all the time. The way that Britain starts trying to put that into practice is with a series of laws called the Navigation Acts. And these were first passed around the 1640s, and there's lots of different navigation acts. So not too long after the colonies are starting to be established, remember Jamestown was 1607, by 1640s you are getting the Navigation Acts. And I'm not going to go into specifically what each of the Navigation Acts said, but this is all about controlling and manipulating colonial trade. This is where all the restrictions are. This is putting all the restrictions and controls on colonial trade so that Britain profits off of colonial trade. So for example, there are some navigation acts that say these goods can only be traded with Britain. You can only trade these things with us. You cannot trade them with anybody else. Or these goods coming into the colonies have to come in on British ships, or they've got to stop in British ports first. The reason for that is so Britain can collect taxes and duties on those things before they ship them out to the colonies. Some countries they cannot trade with, that sort of stuff. It's all these restrictions to make sure that Britain gets the money. Well, we might think, well, the colonists wouldn't like that. Why would they tolerate that sort of thing? Well, the reason that they tolerate that kind of stuff is because Britain does not enforce it. And this is really a symptom of a larger problem that's going on, or maybe not problem, but phenomenon that's going on. So Britain puts these laws in place about the 1640s, but they do not do a very good job of enforcing it. They don't have customs officials, in all of the colonial ports that are inspecting the shipments and looking at all of the things and checking the lists and making sure that everybody's following all the rules. They don't really do that for about a century, for about 100 years. We're not talking about they didn't enforce them for a couple of months. They didn't enforce them for nearly 100 years. And you can imagine, just like today, if we put a rule in school, and there are rules that are like this, I'm sure you can probably think of some, say, hey, here's the rule, and then we don't enforce it. Nobody's going around making sure everybody's doing it. What are you going to do? You're not going to follow the rule, and you're probably not going to have a whole lot of respect for the rule either. And that's exactly what happens in the colonies. Is that because the British government's not going to enforce the Navigation Acts, the colonists aren't going to abide by the Navigation Acts. They're going to get around them. And the main way that the colonists are going to get around the Navigation Acts is by smuggling. Smuggling, of course, means to bring something in illegally. So we have all these goods, and don't think of them, we don't mean illegal goods as in they're bringing in like bad, illicit, stuff. We're talking about, teapots and tea and paint and, just whatever kind of stuff, that's being imported to the colonies, but a lot of it is smuggled. The goods themselves are not illegal, it's the process. They've not gone through the proper channels. They don't have the taxes on them because they've not stopped here and done this and paid these fees and all this kind of business. And smuggling becomes big, big business in the colonies. There are a lot of colonists that make a lot of money off of smugglers or smuggling. In fact, it's not like a black market behind closed doors in the back alleys kind of thing. Everybody's aware of it. It's just life, you know. There are plenty of wealthy, prosperous, respectable, important colonists in their communities and in their colonies that make their money off of smuggling. Their job description might say merchant, but oftentimes that's code for smuggler, or they know they're selling smuggled goods. Most colonial shops and stores are stocked with smuggled goods. A huge percentage of the goods that the colonists buy are smuggled, and they like it that way because that means the prices are lower. They don't want the stuff with all the taxes on it. They want the smuggled stuff that is cheap. And like I said, that just becomes a way of life for a long, long time. And I was mentioned a second ago that this is actually a symptom of a larger phenomenon that's taking place. It's not just the Navigation Acts that the British government's not enforcing. They're not really present at all in the colonies. They're not really all that involved at all in these colonies. They don't have a big hand in what the colonists do. This larger phenomenon is called salutary neglect, okay? You probably know that the word neglect means to leave something alone, to not be involved with it. Salutary means mutually beneficial, means that it helps everybody. This period from about 1640s to, well, we can probably officially say salutary neglect officially ends in 1763. We'll talk later about why. But it's roughly a period of about 100 years where this was kind of the policy of England, both intentionally and in some ways not intentionally. It is their policy of leaving the colonies alone, letting the colonies govern themselves, letting them handle their own business, not having a very strong presence in the colonies, not telling them what to do all the time. The fact that they're not enforcing the Navigation Acts is part of that salutary neglect. They are not there making sure that everything is being done just right and punishing people if they don't obey the law. They're not doing any of that. Now, some of that was intentional. Some of that was always the way that Britain had wanted to manage these colonies. So some of it is just by design. They did not think that it was efficient or practical to try to be so involved in all the things going on in these colonies that are thousands of miles away. That did not make sense to them. And so they have had always, for just reasons of logistics and just thinking it was just an easier way to do things, have always kind of let the colonies, for the most part, kind of handle their own business. They're still their colonies. It's not like they're saying they're totally independent. It's not like they're saying they're not theirs. They're just, as far as the day-to-day running of those colonies, they have let the colonists do that because they just thought that was more practical, and they may have been right about that. Some of this is also unintentional. Some of this is a consequence of events happening in England. You may recall from world history in the 1640s and such, you got the English Civil War going on. You know, they threw out the monarchy for a while. They had bigger business. In other words, there was so much turmoil and so much mess going on in England, they literally could not govern and manage these colonies, even if they had wanted to. That's part of the reason they're having to look the other way. Now, the thing about this salutary neglect, again, mutually beneficial, let me go back, mutually beneficial to both, because for England, it meant that they could have these colonies and these colonies could grow and develop without the bother of having to constantly worry about them and the financial aspect of that and, you know, all those kind of things. For the colonies, that was good, of course, because it meant they could just sort of go about their business and they could enjoy British protection when they needed it. But when it came to, you know, day-to-day stuff, they were able to do it on their own. But here's what is really important about this. This is how this contributes to a greater, the roots of a greater conflict. What this eventually leads to is it leads the colonists to feel, because like I said, this goes on for a whole century. We're not talking about one generation. That's multiple generations of colonists that come to feel, that come to get used to Britain not really having a big of a presence in their lives, the British government not having a big presence in their life. They come to feel that's just the way it's supposed to be. Yes, Britain is our government. We respect them. We love the king. It's all great. We love to be a part of the British Empire, but don't tell us what to do. You know, don't tell us how to run our economy. Don't tell us how to run our lives. You stay over there. We'll stay over here. Everything's fine. And it was like that for a long time, and that seemed to work well for everybody. It means that the colonists don't have a whole lot of respect for British authority. Now, by saying they don't have respect for British authority, that doesn't mean they're sitting around making fun of Parliament and drawing ugly pictures of the king and, all that kind of stuff. We're not to that yet. What I mean is they respect the king and they respect Parliament as long as they don't tell them what to do. It's like that, having respect for them and, considering them their government, but also fully expecting they'd be able to govern themselves. And going back to governing themselves, that's an important point as well. We mentioned all those examples of self-government in the colonies, and we'll mention more later on, and ways that the colonies were self-governing and independent and, democratic from the beginning. Part of that was necessary. They had to govern themselves because Britain wasn't going to do it. So they were the ones that had to make laws. They were the ones that had to build those things up because Britain wasn't going to. Salutary neglect. So that's why all that happens. But as you can probably imagine, just to foreshadow what's to come, because as I've already mentioned, that period of salutary neglect does eventually end. Eventually, what's going to happen is after 100 years of letting these colonies just sort of flout the law, disobey the law, get used to not having British authority in their lives, eventually Britain's going to say, you know what, time's up. Time to start following the rules. Time to start paying those taxes. Time to be reined in, and we're going to be present, and we're going to be a part of this, and you're British subjects, and you're going to do what we say. You can imagine how the colonists are going to not react very well to that. In fact, they will eventually react quite violently to that. So like I've been trying to say, the seeds of the revolution are planted early, early, early. This is not something that just happens overnight. But because of this salutary neglect, that creates this character in the colonies, this feeling of, we love you, but stay away. And, they will react very, like I said, quite violently when they feel like that's being taken away, when they feel like that's being changed, when they feel like that's being violated. So keep that in the back of your mind as far as what is to come. And later we will look at more ways in which the colonies are coming into their own, kind of making their own way, growing and changing, and then also some ways that things that cause them to really question, going political beliefs at the time as well.